Hello everybody. Thank you for your time in listening my Ph.D. dissertation thesis entitled A Framework to Characterize and Influence Spatial Perception in Heterogeneous Virtual Reality Displays. Mm, my, um, my advisors are Paulo Figueroa, Tiberio Hernandez, Frédéric Merien, and Jean-Rémy Chardonnay. So the motivation of this thesis is that we have there is some spatial perception issues in VR where distances are systematically underestimated and or overestimated, and this phenomenon is known as the depth compression phenomenon. So in order to perceive depth, we use different depth cues that can be classified as visual and oculomotor. However, virtual reality displays distorts the way these visual cues works, influence negatively the perception of distances. The most challenging cues are to simulate are the oculomotor cues. And some of the most challenging issues are the Vergennes accommodation mismatch issue and the incorrect peripheral stimulation issue, which is associated with the restricted field of view and the distortions induced by the lens. So to make things a little bit more complicated, today we have a great variety of displays in the market. We have, for example, the large immersive projection displays, and we have the popular consumer-oriented head-mounted displays, and these displays are very heterogeneous. For example, the most representative display for the large immersive projection displays is the CAPE, and this display was originally devised to overcome the limitation of head-mounted display in terms of the optical distortions and the visual acuity. So, but even inside a head-mounted display, could exist differences. Depending of the vendor. For example, depending on the kind of lens and the kind of the resolution. So, this could cause differences in performance depending on the kind of spatial tags. So if subject perform an spatial tag in a particular display, the performance is not going to be the same in another display. And this difficulty is the sign of natural shared experiences between devices because it's not transparently to develop attacks in heterogeneous displays without need of some kind of adaptation. So the research question in this thesis is how we can characterize and improve spatial perception in VR by considering the display issues that influences the performance. So we can design more natural shared experiences. So in order to answer this research question, we define three objectives. The first is to characterize and influence the display issues, how the display issues influence the spatial perception. The second is to find or design some transversal assessment methods. With what I mean with transversal is that we can perform a spatial perception tests independently of the technology. So we can compare the spatial performance between heterogeneous displays. And finally, to improve spatial perception based on the influence of the different display factors. So a review of the literature shown that the studying spatial perception in VR is quite complex. Renner arranged the phenomenology in three areas: technical, human, and compositional. And technical refers to the different display factors that influence the spatial performance. Human is related with calibration and adaptation. And compositional refers to all the different techniques that we use to influence the perception of depth. For example, linear perspective, the simulation of light and shadows, and stereoscopy. But also the measurement method is another factor that influence the perception of distances and the performance, because depending on the kind of assessment tax, there is going to be differences in the perception of distances. So regarding the technical factors, we identify four as the most important. The first is the focal distance. The second is the distortions induced by the lens, the restricted field of view, and the stereoscopic parallax condition. Stereoscopic parallax is basically the location of the stimulus in relation with the screen. So when the object is located behind the screen, this is known as negative parallax. When it's located in front of the screen, this is known as positive parallax. And when it's located at the focal distance, is known as zero parallax. So we review a set of different studies with analyzed influence of the different display factors in the perception of depth. But however, most of this work use like a reductionist approach. So they isolate the influence of the different display factors and a particular set of depth cues. This is no using some kind of stimulus that are very different to the stimulus that we found under natural conditions. So we try to use a different approach and try to analyze the influence of these display factors, but in a more holistic approach, using a more natural stimulus. So regarding the human factors, this is more related to how the virtual stimulus influence the action perception feedback loop. So we found in the literature that there is two different kinds of perception of distances. A kind of perception of distance where people don't need to perform an action, but they perform some kind of perceptual judgment, and another kind of perception of distance where people perform an action, and the kind of action that we implement influence the perception of distance also. So for this reason, it's quite different to assess the perception of distance using a verbal estimate, for example, compared with assess the perception of distance using an action. And depending on the iteration technique, the perception of distance is going to vary. For example, it's quite different to measure the perception of distance using a treadmill, or using a virtual controller, or walking naturally. So, for that reason, we found in the literature two different kinds of assessment methods. The first is the visually directed action tags, or also known as the blind methods, where people perform distance estimates by performing an action under non-visual conditions. And the second is the perceptual matching tags, where people don't need to perform an action, but they assess the perception, the distance indirectly, taking advantage of percept couplings. For example, the relationship that exists between the perception of size and the perception of distances. In this research, we pay special attention to the blind working and the size constancy test. We also found that the visually directed action tags, the blind methods, are more ideal for HMDs, because people can walk and move more freely. In contrast, the large immersive projection displays, the method preferred was the perceptual matching tags, due to the spatial restrictions that exist in this kind of displays. So an obvious way to solve this issue is to continue to improve technology. So there is some proposals of displays that can overcome the limitation of the different display issues, for example, divergence accommodation mismatch. But however, the researchers are still working in reduce the hardware complexity and the computational demands of these solutions. So a group of researchers have proposed an alternative approach, which is using composition to influence the perception of distances. For example, by playing with the rules of perspective. So, and applying some kind of transformation in perspective projections. So, we from this kind of techniques, we identified two as good candidates for the proposed framework. We identify the lowering horizon technique, which is a technique that basically simulates an angular declination in the horizon. So this move downward the vanishing points, and this increase the perception of distances. And the second is an FEV magnification technique, which basically projects a field of view greater than the provided by the display. So this changed the rate of convergence of the vanishing points. So everything is compressed, but looks more smaller, but at the same time looks further away. So our contribution is to propose a method to characterize and influence spatial perception in heterogeneous displays. And this contribution can be seen as a framework composed of two parts. The first is characterized, which is basically assessing spatial perception using a display independent test, using an assessment method independently of the technology. And the second is that we denominate influencing, which is using composition to improve the spatial performance. So normally in the literature, these two parts have been studied independently. So we propose to integrate these components in a framework. So the framework can be seen also as a process composed of 5 steps. We start first with a transversal spatial test, an assessment method that can be used independently of the display technology. Then we perform a display characterization. So we analyze what are the most influential factors, and depending on the kind of spatial tags. Then we perform a stimuli selection, where the stimulus are selected strategically to analyze the influence of the different display factors. Then, after assessing the subject spatial performance, we perform a linear performance predictor, which is a linear regression function, which characterizes the amount of the depth compression induced by the display, and based on this information, we can apply a transformation in perspective projection. We can apply some of the different techniques that I mentioned before, the FUV magnification technique of the lowering horizon technique, in order to improve the perception of distances. So this part is what we denominate characterize, and the last part is what we denominate influencing. So in order to validate this, the proposed framework, we selected 2 study cases. We selected 2 assessment methods as good study cases. We selected the size constancy test, which was proposed by Kenyon and Luo, and we proposed the blind working test, which was proposed by Loomis. The first is ideal to analyze the influence of the divergence accommodation mismatch issue, while the second is ideal to analyze the influence of the incorrect peripheral stimulation issue. So we are going to start to explain how we apply the framework for the first size constancy test. So this test is very simple. The subject is presented with a physical reference, and he needs to estimate what will be the relative size of some virtual replicas, which are presented with some exaggerated dimensions at different target distances. And the target distances are selected strategically to analyze the influence of the divergence accommodation mismatch issue. So there is this stimulus at negative parallax, positive parallax, and 0 parallax. However, this assessment method was originally devised for for cave systems because subjects are able to visualize the physical and the virtual environment simultaneously, so they can visualize the physical reference. However, there is no proposal of this test for HMDs. And for that reason, we implemented a variation of this test in order to introduce to analyze the influence of the Vergenza convention mismatch issue in head-mounted displays. Kenin and Liu propose this equation to analyze to measure the performance of the subject, which is the size ratio, which is basically the ratio, the measurement of the estimated size versus the actual size. So, the first objective of the framework is to design non-transversal spatial text. Based on this idea, we designed a study where we were interested in comparative performance between the CAPE and the HND. Because this test was not originally devised in the HND, and because subjects are not able to visualize the physical reference, in the HND we propose the use of propositive feedback instead of visual feedback in order to perform these tasks. So the general idea is the subjects are not able to visualize the physical reference, but they can use their length of their hands and the length of the table in order to estimate the relative size of the reference and the relative, and use this information to estimate the precise size and distance of the virtual replicas. Similarly, they perform the same tasks in the HND. So our hypothesis was that the size ratio response would reflect a greater size constancy in the cave compared with the HND. So we expect that the performance in the cave is going to be will be better than in the HND. And second, we expect that the size ratio response will be influenced by the amount of conflict induced between the divergence and accommodation. So we performed an experiment using a within subjects configuration, where a total of 8 subjects participate, and they perform 6 trials for 3 target distances and using 2 virtual environments. And we alternated the object in order to prevent bias related with the learning effects. So, so these are the results of the test. This is the performance of the subject in terms of size ratio, and these are the target distances. So contrarily to our expectations, the performance the performance in the CAPE was worse compared with the performance in the HND. But however, we identified that there is a greater tendency of size constancy in the CAPE. The perception of size doesn't vary significantly depending on the distance, which is quite different in the HND, where there is some evidence of size constancy. But this is only at short distances. Regarding the unfortunately, our second hypothesis does not hold. What would you expect is a pattern similar to the pattern found by Kenyon and Luo, so that the best performance is found at 0 parallels when the stimulus is located at the focal distance at 0 parallels, and you expect to find some overestimation of size on underestimation of distances at negative parallels and positive parallels. But we find on very different pattern, and we believe this is a consequence that we are using propositive feedback instead of visual feedback. That is the way that the experiment was developed in Kenyon and Luo. So despite the unexpected results, we believe that the size constancy test is a good a good assessment method, a good has the potential to be has the potential of being a good, very good transversal spatial test, because we identified some important differences between the cave and the H&D. So the next step of the framework is to perform a display characterization and develop on a stimuli selection. So the display characterization is basically to analyze how the different display factors influence the perception of can influence the perception of distance and size. So for example, if we perform a graph of the amount of complete size induced as a function of the focal distance, we identified that there is two ways to improve the perception of distance. The most obviously is to locate the stimulus at the focal distance, so the amount of complete between the invergence and accommodation is 0. And another way is to increase the focal distance. By increasing the focal distance, we reduce the accommodative demands. So this also reduces the amount of complete induced between invergence and accommodation. So we can notice here, for example, if we compare the amount of complete induced between an HMD with a focal distance of 0.75 meters and a cave with a focal distance of 0.2 meters, the performance in the HMD is more worse compared with the performance in the cave. The impact is more negative. So a natural way to analyze the influence of the convergence accommodation conflict in a display is to select a stimulus distributed linearly according to the focal distance. So we have a stimulus either a negative parallax, positive parallax, and zero parallax. Similarly, we can perform the same analysis in the cave, but there is a fundamental difference between both displays, and the difference is that in the HMDs use a lens that has a fixed focal distance, while in the cave the focal distance is variable. And for that reason, si we are interested in compare the spatial performance between display, we can select the same focal distance in both displays, but if we are interested in improve the perception of distances, we can increase the focal distance, in this case in the cave, in order to improve the perception of distances. So everything depends on the kind of result that we are interested. So after selecting this stimuli strategically, we can calculate a linear performance predictor. So the linear performance predictor is basically an analysis of the performance of the subject using linear regression, where we can compare the amount of underestimation of distances with the target distances. So, and also in terms of the stereoscopic parallax condition. So, for example, we can see here that the performance of the subject was worse in the HND compared with the cave. So if we calculate the regression slope, we can calculate the amount of depth compression or the amount of the underestimation using this equation, where D is the target distance, C is the regression slope, and this is the amount of underestimation induced by the display. So this information is useful because we can apply a transformation in perspective projection. For example, in this case, the most ideal is the lowering horizon technique, because this technique doesn't change the perception of size. So si we apply on an angular declination in the horizon line, we can improve the perception of distance of distances. So this technique is very simple to implement. So it uses an oblique perspective projection. So it basically simulates that the display is not parallel to the line of sight, but is in some way oblique. So this changes the apparent location of the horizon line, and this improve the perception of distances. So as a contribution of the research, we implemented these techniques at vertex level. And this was necessary because current generation of HNDs doesn't allow to change the render pylon and the parameters in which the display was calibrated. So the only way that we find to implement this technique was to change the orientation of the vertex in view space before the projection is computed. So we can see how this technique works. This is how the technique is seen in the Unity editor. So basically, we are actually not changing the position of the vertex, but we are only changing its projection. So we are simulating an angular declination in the horizon line. So in order to validate this idea, we decided to implement a study to analyze if by using this technique we can influence positively the perception of distances. So we compared the performance of the subjects using the default projection technique and using the lowering horizon technique. So for example, you can see here that by changing the direction of the vanishing points, we are simulating like a table more longer than the actual size. So our hypothesis is that by using these techniques, the performance will be better compared with the default projection technique. And nuestra second hypothesis is that this technique also will improve the perception of size constancy. So we perform an experimental study using a within subject configuration where a total of 10 participants, and they performed 5 trials with 3 target distances and using the two projection techniques. And also we alternated the object in order to prevent bias with learning effects. So this is the result of the experiment. Our first hypothesis partially holds. So the lower innovation technique effectively improves the perception of size and distances, but not significantly for all the 3 target distances. However, our second hypothesis does not hold. By using the lowering horizon technique, we impact negatively the perception of size constancy. So, but in general terms, the lowering horizon technique is a good method to improve the perception of distance. The problem is how to select the optimal angular declination in order to improve the perception of distance and size. But the general idea of this framework is that it's not like a frame of reference, but it's like some kind of guideline. So you can test a proof, and we test a lot of ideas, different methods to analyze the perception of distance and the influence of the different display factors. So we implemented an alternative study where we combine proprioceptive feedback and visual feedback. And this study, by applying this variation and including additional cues, we improve the perception of size constancy. You can see, I'm not going to enter in details about this study, but you can see the information in the document. So the general idea is that you can prove different ideas. For example, this is a good method to improve the perception of size, but the problem is you can only use in head-mounted displays. Now I'm going to present how we applied the framework in our second study case, the blind walking test. So similarly to the previous the study case, we start with a transversal spatial test. So one of our first idea to compare the performance was to use a treadmill. So the treadmill allows us to compare the performance not only between head-mounted displays, but also in large immersive projection displays and CAPE systems. However, the result of this idea were not good. Unfortunately, the treadmill it causes a lot of issues. For example, some users didn't get used to the iteration technique. Other users suffered of fatigue. So the treadmill became a very confounding factor, and we didn't find a significant difference between displays. So and we find a lot of variability. So we understand that natural locomotion is fundamental for this kind of spatial perception tests. So despite this unexpected result, we believe that the blind work is a good method, for example, to compare the performance in HNDs, where people can work naturally. So the next step of the process was similar to perform a display characterization and perform a stimuli selection. So similarly, we can we analyze, for example, what is the influence of the stimulus, of the influence of the distortions induced by the lens and the field of view, and how this affect the peripheral vision, and what this will be the difference, for example, between the ocular ribs and the HTC Vive. For example, how the lens distorts the angular resolution in the peripheral vision. So we can simulate what will be the amount of underestimation induced in terms of the perception of depth, and then we can select some stimulus strategically selected to characterize the influence of the display of the distortions induced in the peripheral stimulus. So in order to validate this idea and to characterize the amount of compression induced in the display in terms of the peripheral stimulation, we perform a blind walking test, which is a very simple test where subject is presented with a visual stimulus, and they need to walk towards the location of the object under no vision condition, totally blind. So, but one interesting question about this spatial perception is the influence of adaptation. What will happen, for example, if we allow subject to walk some minutes in the virtual environment and interact in the virtual environment before performing the spatial perception test? And there is some evidence that they interacted in the virtual environment with visual feedback influence positively the perception of distances. So the subject suffers some kind of motor recalibration, and the perception of distances change, and some studies have shown that this process of adaptation occurs very fast. So our hypothesis was that the perception of distances will be influenced by the peripheral stimulation issue in both conditions, either without adaptation and after adaptation. And then we expect that the performance after adaptation it will be better compared with the performance without adaptation. So we perform an experimental study using a within subject configuration, where a total of 16 subjects participate. We compare the two conditions. They perform first the blind walking test without adaptation. Then they perform 5 minutes of adaptation, and then we perform the blind walking test after the adaptation step. And a total of 5 trials with retarded distances, and the two conditions were evaluated. So this is the amount of the underestimation. This is the error in terms of distance, and this were the target distances. So we alternated the target distances in order to prevent bias with learning effects. And but unfortunately, our hypothesis partially holds. So we found that the peripheral stimulation issue impacts negatively the perception of distance, but the influence is more stronger in the predation condition. The amount underestimation increase as the distance increase, but in the post-adaptation condition, there is like a more steady tendency. So this means that the adaptation is a good method to improve the perception of distances. Unfortunately, we have a lot of variability in subject responses, and we believe that this could be a consequence of different issues and some distortions that our FU magnification technique have, and some limitations that our technique have. Some limitation in our study that the influence causes this like a poor performance. And for that reason, our second hypothesis, we believe that does not hold. We didn't find significant differences within the pre-adaptation and the post-adaptation condition. Finally, we can apply similarly to the previous study on linear performance predictor. So, for example, we can analyze the comparative performance between the pre-adaptation and post-adaptation condition, and try to characterize and predict the amount of compression induced in the display. However, because there is a lot of variability in subject response, the confiability of the regression, the phenomenon is linear, is probably no confiable. So everything depends of the confidence of the subject in their distance estimators. So, but we are able to measure with some precision the amount of we are able to calculate the linear performance predictor successfully. We can apply a transformation in perspective projection. So in this case, the most ideal is the FUV magnification technique, because this technique expands the field of view and reduces the variation of the angular resolution in the visual field. So this reduce the influence of the peripheral stimulation issues in spatial perception. So the technique, as I mentioned before, basically it projects a field of view greater than the provided by the display. So everything is become more compressed, and this increase the perception of distances. You can see the implementation of the technique here. See, this is the default projection technique, so everything looks normal. And then we can apply and the next is the view magnification technique. So we are expanding the field of view, and at the same time we are increasing the perception of distances. So our hypothesis was that this technique will improve the perception of distances compared with the default projection technique. So we similarly performed a study using a within subject configuration with a total of 16 subjects participate. We compared the performance using the default projection and the FUV magnification, and we found that the FUV magnification technique effectively improved the perception of distances compared with the default projection technique. So it is an excellent method to improve the perception of distance in VR. We found also the significant differences. As I mentioned before, pues, the framework is like a guideline. So as we learn and as we understand the phenomenon, we can explore different assessment methods. So an alternative approach to the blind working method is the blind triangulated pointing. This assessment method has the advantage that people don't need to walk very large distances. So it can be used, for example, in cave systems where there is some spatial restrictions. So I'm not going to enter in details about this study, but you can see the details in the document. So finally, this is the proposed framework, and these are the results of the proposed framework. So in terms of the size constancy test, we analyze the influence of the divergence accommodation conflict issue. So we achieved a transversal spatial test. So we are able to compare the performance between the CAPE and the H&D. We characterize successfully the influence of the compression phenomenon. And by applying the lowering horizon technique, we influence positively the perception of distances. But the results were not perfect because we affect the perception of size constancy. Regarding the blind working test, we analyzed the influence of the peripheral stimulation issue. The problem is we couldn't achieve a transversal spatial test, but the method is useful for HMDs. We can characterize the influence of the different display issues, and by applying the FEV modification technique, we improve the perception of distances in VR. However, the characterization depends on the confiability of confidence of the subject in their distance estimators. So our techniques have some kind of distortion or some kind of limitations. For example, there is something that we denominate a nonlinear mapping between the virtual and motion space, where some vertex became misaligned with the orientation of the head. And also we have some limitations in terms of the computation of shadows and lights, but we are working in like a second version of these techniques which are solving some kind of all these issues. So as future work, we are interested to study other transversal methods which are able to be used in the framework. For example, the blind triangulated pointing. Then we are interested to improve the techniques that influence spatial perception and solving, for example, the distortions I mentioned it before. And we need to connect better the influence of the display factors with the techniques that influence spatial perception. So we know how these factors influence the perception of distance, and we know that in some way we can use linear regression to predict and influence spatial perception, but we need to connect these two parts a little bit more better. We need to improve the perception of distance more effectively, and this depends on how we can select the optimal angular declination or the optimal scaling in the field of view to improve the perception of distances. In the document I wrote some ideas, but I couldn't validate it. And finally, the idea is to propose some kind of guidelines or model to characterize and influence spatial perception in VR.
I have hopefully a simple question to start.
Okay.
Did you look at the more system parameters for your experiments? Like, for example, making both environments, the large displays and the headsets, as equivalent as possible, related to resolution, related to frame rates, related to latency? Do you do some kind of system performance characterization prior to the more of the framework? Did you look at any of that?
No. I studied some things about, for example, the resolution, some things related with calibration, but we mostly focus on the focal distance and the field of view in this kind of elements. But all these elements also influence the perception of the distance in VR. But from my review in the literature, the most relevant were the focal distance and the influence, the peripheral stimulation issues.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
for example, in the peripheral vision, the resolution also influences the perception of distances also.
Yeah. Because we notice sometimes that those parameters are going to have an impact in there. I was, you know, as I was hearing you talking and I was reading your thesis, I was just, you know, this is sort of the same, I guess, question in a lot of the different studies that we all do. What was your method to determine your subjects, how many subjects you want, especially on those experiments where you have so much variation? And what I know it's painful, but I don't know, did you went back and thought, well, I'm having a lot of variation, maybe it has to do with my sample size, or it might have to do with some other factor?
Yes, at the beginning, our first studies were like some kind of exploratory. So we select a very limited amount of subjects. So this is like a limitation of the first studies. So because we are like testing ideas and proving ideas, and so but at the end we try to increment a little bit more the amount of subjects. So we have 16, but uh, the idea is at least to have minimum 20, which is I think is the minimum suggested in order to have an OVA, because most of the statistical analysis that we use no parametrical statistical tests like t-test, so the confiability of t-tests is not as good as compared with the ANOVA and other kind of statistical tests.
And then I just have a little detail, because I noticed the one of the objects that you were using for the size estimation was a bottle, a Coke bottle kind of thing. But when you put it at zero parallax, that's not really zero parallax, because in order to be zero parallax, it will have to be a flat object that aligns with the plane. So you had a little bit of depth in there, which probably is not a big impact. This is just more of a curious comment than a question. But I don't know if you thought a little bit about that.
Yes, I remember your suggestion in when I presented my proposal exam. So in the last study, I changed it the bottle
I see that.
by
Yes,
objects
I
more
like it.
plain.
Thank you.
Because it's, yes, I think that it's more easy to align
You
the
remember my comment. Thank you
yes.
for a few months ago. That's
So
wonderful.
this is one of the changes I did in the last experiment.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I'll pass it to Steve, because I see you're anxious to ask questions, Steve.
Thank you, Carolina.
Okay, give me 1 second, please. Just wanted to finish writing something down. Okay, so this is neat work, and I'm trying to see if I can maybe come up with some questions that can kind of get your feedback on some alternatives. The cave condition that you were doing, it looks like you were mostly doing things on the walls of the cave. Is that correct?
Yes, in the front wall.
Okay. There is no sort of an alternative to the vertical surfaces at the front wall, which would be found in the floor of a cave or in the single surface of the so-called responsive workbench type setups, the sort in which you're doing a rear projection onto a horizontal surface. And for looking at, for example, a view of terrain, which when you're looking at it on a wall of a cave, everything is going to accommodate at the distance of the wall. When you present something that's, roughly like, for example, that tabletop over there on a horizontal rear projected surface, then when you look at things that are close, they're going to accommodate, pretty approximately decently to the way that they should. And when you look at things at the far end of the responsive workbench, they will also accommodate pretty close to the way in which they should. So can you say something about how you think people would respond to a study in which you were using that kind of presentation, in which you could maybe even do that literally by having the subject perhaps, sit on the floor in the cave and just presenting the information projected onto the floor?
Yeah. This is probably one of the limitations of the study in the cave, because we try to fuse the physical table with the virtual table, and this illusion was be very difficult to achieve, because as you mentioned, in the floor there was a projection also. So when people moved their head, the illusion was lost. So we propose, for example, to change the table with a table made of glass, so you can fuse both. But a more simple alternative was to sit the subject in is equal to be to sit the subject in the floor, so there is no influence of the of the of the physical object in there is no distortion in the of the physical object in the experience. So that's one of the reasons that I believe that the performance in the cave was very different compared with the performance in the HND.
Okay. Now, another thing I'm noticing in that cave is you have very crisp, real features where the two walls intersect. You know, which is, I mean, that's really problematic, as Carolina knows far better than I do. You know, getting things to look good where the two walls, where any two walls meet, is like one of the really hard things to do. And I can see from there in that image, you can see very crisp, clear, easily verged and accommodated artifacts where the walls meet. And you're seeing those throughout your experience inside that cave. And I was wondering if that fact that you can see things, it's as if you had like a dirty wall, for example, with clearly, you know, physical stuff on it, the kind that you wouldn't want to have in a cave. Do you think that had any influence on how people were responding?
Yes. In order to make this video, I turned on the light because normally the cave is very dark, so you can see the borders more drastically. But in the experiment, I turn off the light, so the borders are cannot see clearly, and the dirt also. So only was in order to make the video.
Okay, let's think some other things. So when you did the field of view minification technique, were you simply, what exactly were you doing in terms of the projection? Given that this is in stereo, right? Were you doing anything with the IPD? Or was the IPD the same?
Yes, I implemented. I changed the I changed the position of the vertex in view space, but I didn't consider the IPD. So this is problematic because each eye has a different point of view. So if you separate started to separate the position of the vertex, the disparity increase. So this causes discomfort. And people with use the view magnification suffer of, some of them suffer of cyber sickness, because you are increasing the disparity, and this increase the discomfort. The brain had more difficulties in fusing the images. So this is one of the things I need to improve, and I'm trying to improve now.
There certainly are very big differences in how people react, even emotionally, to a small versus, or rather, their actual IPD or something relatively close to it, versus, let's say, giant size stereo, where the two virtual eyes are much further apart than your real ones. You know, giving you a sense kind of looking at a bunch of toys rather than things that are really the size that they really are.
Yeah, it's more problematic when you're looking something closer than when you're looking something far away.
Even if there's something far away, you know, it can look very different. You know, I'm thinking of, for example, Google Earth VR, in which by default they use giant size stereo, which in part accounts for that sort of sense that you're, you know, this god looking down on the planet, which you don't get if you actually in Google Earth VR, for example, has a setting that you can change that they call, quotes, experimental, in which they'll use your regular IPD, which gives you a very different feeling about how far away things are, and what your relationship is to them.
Yes.
Okay, let's see.
Steve, before we jump out of IPD, can I march in for a second?
Sure, please go right ahead.
Jose Luis, did you have the same IPD for both systems, or you use whatever default IPD was on the SDKs that you were using?
Yes, I measured the IPD in the first experiment using an optometric device. So I measured the IPD in the cave and the HND. I try to calibrate both displays. So because the IPD is very important.
For each user or for the experiment itself?
For each user.
For each user. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Because yeah, that's of course, as Steve says, has a big impact. All right. Sounds good. Thank you. Sorry, Steve.
Okay, no problem. Let's see, another question. One thing I noticed that was not in your list of papers, there were a couple of papers that came out of Vicky Interante's lab around early 2011 or so, with Phillips as first author, in which they were trying to understand better this notion of underestimation, and had found that in photorealistic environments that actually were virtual versions of their own lab, that people had much less underestimation than when they used less photorealistic representations of the environment.
There is true. There is a contradictory group of researchers which state that the problem is not a problem of the technology, but it's a problem of presence and immersion. So when you see a photorealistic environment and you are familiarized with this environment, this activates some other parts of the brain, and the underestimation of distance decrease. So there is like a sort of discussion about that. And I think it's probably related with that, because at the end, immersion is also a function of the display of the technology of the. So.
Yeah, because I think it would be good to actually cite those papers in your set of references. Let's see. So, a couple of other questions. I'm noticing that in your experiments, this is certainly not unusual, because there's a certain amount of self-selection in the people who volunteered or willing to participate in an experiment. But in the one from 3.2.1, you had only male participants. You had 8 male and 2 female in the next experiment after that. Then finally, you get sort of a 2-to-1 male to female ratio. And I was wondering, do you see any sex-related differences in the performance of your subjects? Clearly, you wouldn't notice that in the first experiment because you had only male participants.
Yes. But I have little amount of females, but I notice, for example, that they are the amount of underestimation tend to be a little bit more greater when they work in the black box test, but in perceptual matching they had a very good performance. So probably it's maybe the way of evolution. I don't know that how the men were prepared for moving the environment and find food, and females were more prepared to analyze the environment, and I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Those are all speculations that you can make or not make, right? I'm thinking also in terms of, there's interesting work that came out of Mary Chewinski's group back quite a while ago on the difference in performance of women and men in relatively small field of view versus larger field of view displays, where the difference in spatial performance was, and this is a very robust result, women did much less well than men with small fields of view. And yet with larger fields of view, men and women both did better, but there was a much, much smaller difference in performance with these sort of larger field of view displays. And of course, you're using ones which, no matter how much we talk about how wonderfully high field of view our displays are, there's still a fraction of what you can see, even with your head held constant and your eyes looking straight ahead. A healthy younger person has more than 180 degrees, typically more than 190 degrees worth of horizontal field of view with no eye motion and no neck motion, which is just, incredibly better than what we can get with pretty much any of the current head-worn displays. So I was just wondering if you, had what you were seeing in terms of differences in performance on the cave environment, which you are getting pretty much your natural field of view horizontally, especially if you're looking forward, versus in the head-worn displays in which you're severely restricted in terms of field of view.
Yes, we didn't, for example, compare the influence of the peripheral stimulation issue in the cave.
Mhm.
But one of our last ideas was to use the blind triangulated pointing. So in this kind of test, we can analyze the influence of the context of the environment. So I think that the performance in the cave is going to be better compared with the H&D, because you have more information in the peripheral vision, and the lens doesn't distort the motion of the objects around, or the motion parallax cue and the optic flow. So, but we could then validate it. So this is probably something in the future work.
Okay. Can I ask one more question? I'm realizing I'm taking a lot more time maybe than we have available. So the last one, just as I was reading, especially the beginning of the thesis, I noticed you had some numbers for horizontal field of view for headsets that sounded to me extraordinary. I mean, they are extraordinarily high. I think you were quoting like 120 or 130 degrees horizontal field of view in these commodity headsets, and they simply don't have that. So just wondering where those numbers came from.
200 field of view?
No, you quoted 130, I think, maybe for an Oculus Rift, perhaps, CV1, or 120, which is way beyond what they actually support.
Yes, probably I made a mistake, because the field of view also depends on the eye relief, the distance between the eyes and the lens.
That's right. That's
probably
true.
It's smaller than the actual field of view provided by the display. So this is something I forget to mention in the document, and it's very significant, important, because
I fully understand that.
Headset.
Yep. No, I fully understand that, but I do know that unless you somehow manage to pop your eyes out of your head and stick them way, way, way into the headset, there's no way you're going to get 130 or 120 out of a CV1 Rift.
Yes, it's impossible. Some people have changed some of the internal configuration in order to achieve more field of view, but it's quite impossible to achieve the 110 degrees.
Okay.
First one, I have a comment, because the thesis title is the same as the chapter 3 title. So I thought that the main part of the work was presented in this chapter, but the chapter 3 is only the first part of the framework. And the chapter 4 is the second part of the framework with an important proposal and development. So I propose that you review the titles of the chapter 3 and the chapter 4 in the document.
Yes,
I think both chapters are the base of your framework.
Yes, at the beginning I have the second part in the same chapter, but I believe the chapter was too long, so I decided to separate it, but I forget to
change
the
and to
title.
correlate the title of the chapters. So it is my comment. And I have only a question.
Yes.
In your research question, you mentioned the design of shared experience between heterogeneous displays. I found in the document different tests of experiment that were applied to understand the spatial perception issues in a specific display system like the CAPE systems and the HMD systems.
Yes.
You mentioned that different issues are found specifically for these systems separately. And unfortunately, there is no experiment of a shared VR experience in this respect in your work. So my question is how the result of the proposed framework can be applied to design VR shared experience by users using heterogeneous displays that are very different, like HMDs and CAPEs.
Yes. In terms of the size constancy test, we believe that we can compare the performance with the CAPE and the HND. But you have reason in the blind working test, we didn't compare the performance, for example, with the CAPE. But as I mentioned before, there could exist not only differences between the CAPE and the HND, but also between HNDs. And one of the experiments that we performed was comparing the performance between the HTC Vive and this GRVR. And this space is very different from the HTC Vive because you don't have a motion tracking of the head, and the resolution is very different compared with the resolution in the Vive. So they are quite similar because they are head-mounted display, but they are very different. So, but the general idea is to, depending on the kind of spatial tags, we can select the most ideal displays to compare. For example, by using this test, the blind angulated point, we believe we can compare the CAPE with the HND.
So, okay. What do you think can be proposed at this respect in the future work of your thesis?
My idea is
because you didn't mention that in your final part of the document.
Yes, you have reason. One thing that I can propose at the end of my work is that we have like a set of depth queues. These queues are influenced by different display factors, and there is some kind of spatial task that you can perform, for example, in the personal space and the action space. So you can propose like some kind of guidelines or models in order to compare the performance between displays and propose some spatial perception tests for each kind of particular tags and depth queues. So this is like the ideal of what I expect to have at the end, probably in a postdoc, but this is the objective. And probably also find like a way to integrate the proposed framework with advancing technology, because I think in a few years some of these issues are going to be solved, but at the same time I think that there is some kind of application where having a precise perception of distance is not ideal. So for example, you need to influence or exaggerate the perception of distances to improve the performance. For example, in sport training or in other kind of tasks. So I think the framework can have other applications in the future.
Okay, and do you think that the VR shared experience with so different system are working fine in the future?
I think at the end, probably all these display technologies are going to converge. Probably mixed reality and virtual reality and augmented reality are going to converge to what the researchers denominate today as like XR. So I believe in the future there is going to be like some kind of ultimate display. So probably in a very long future, I don't think that this issue is going to be this proposal of this framework is going to be obsolete. But like any kind of thinking technology in the long future.
So you're using displays for the headsets that essentially are accommodating at a single distance. And yet there are some commercial ones, I'm thinking in particular of the Magic Leap one, that can accommodate at, I think it's 2 distances. And there are other companies that don't really have products out, but have like the beginnings of sort of not quite alpha, I think, even products out, like Lightspace, for example, that have multiple depths at which they accommodate. Not to mention true light field displays that we know are coming down the pike eventually, but which aren't here yet. How do you think things would work out if you had a display of that sort to experiment with? What would your predictions be about how it would perform?
Yes, I remember that for example, the first version of the HTC Vive has like a knob, so you can change the eye relief and you can change the focal distance.
A little bit, but uniformly. So you're going to have to reach up and play around with it, and of course you know that you're playing around with it. And at all times, everything at any given point in time is going to accommodate at the same distance, whatever that distance is. But I'm actually suggesting displays like ultimately light field displays where brightness and accommodation will be perfectly matched in a perfect light field display of the sort we'd all love to have and certainly don't have right now, except for the real world. But there are some displays that are a little closer to that. Again, you know, Magic Leap 1, which can accommodate at 2 different distances. As I said, there's other companies like Lightspace that have other approaches that you know are not yet really products that can accommodate at more distances, let alone some of the ones that you can see at, you know, eTech and SIGGRAPH that can accommodate at a much larger number of distances, but again are not really products. So if you had such a display to work with, let's say a real light field display, how do you think things would work in your experiments?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because by using when this improvement in technology, probably the amount of conflict induced between Bergens's accommodation is going to be reduced. So you have the cue from the blur and the correct stimulus in terms of blur and the phenomenon of the compression is going to be influenced more negatively. But at the same time, in my understanding, the problem is very quite complex because they are like four-dimensional. They use like a 4-dimensional depth of field, so it's very complex to simulate and with precision the way the performance of the human visual system. So you have you can respond effectively to the change in the orientation of the eye and the orientation of the head, and you get the correct stimulus. So for example, I think this technology could take more time compare, for example, with varifocal displays, where they simulated more discretely this phenomenon.
Mhm.
So in this case, I think my framework can continue to contribute in using this kind of, because it's discrete, no, it's continuous. But when live field displays or near eye live field display became available, probably I'm going to be more interested in try to influence the perception of distance, not to improve the performance, to improve to approximately to the virtual world, but to achieve another results. For example, to exaggerate it in order to improve the performance in, for example, in sport training or another kind of application. So probably it depends. Everything is a question of time. How longer it takes to have some of these displays.
So if you had one of those displays, let's say in your experiment, and you had it as an additional condition besides, let's say, the headsets that you're currently using, how do you think that would compare?
Sorry again, could you repeat?
If let's say if you were to have hypothesize taking any of the experiments that you've run that have had a headset as one of the conditions, and imagine an additional condition in which instead of using, let's say, an HTC Vibe, you had another condition that used a display that might have a ability to actually do a much better job of matching versions of accommodation. I was asking, how do you think that display would, the condition that used that display would compare with the results you're getting from, say, the HTC Vive condition in that experiment?
So I will expect that for example, using a live field display or varifocal display, subjects are going to perceive more effectively the distances are shorter distances, because they are going to get the correct stimulus in terms of blur, which is a cue it's an important cue in the perception of depth. But in the largest distance, I think that the performance is going to be quite similar, because in the larger distance there is another kind of cues that became more relevant, like linear perspective. So probably the performance is going to be, I'm sure that it's going to be better at shorter distances, but quite similar at larger distances.
Though it is the case that at those greater distances, depending upon the distance at which things accommodate in the particular headsets that you were using and how they were adjusted on your head, for something that was, let's say, 30 or 40 feet away, that is not the distance at which, say, a Vive is going to accommodate, no matter how you adjust it. While this theoretical, light field display really would accommodate for a 30 or 40 foot verged object at 30 or 40 feet.